Welcome, you're listening to the Renegade River Show, and my name is Mike Hewitt, and in the studio today is Jim Riley.
I'm back.
Jim.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. You got to tell me, I'm really confused. Government says it's shut down, but it looks like 83% of the government's still operating, except for the parts that are most obvious to the citizenry, like, say, the World War II monument or the bags over the tops of the heads of Mount Rushmore. I'm a little bit confused. What's really going on, Jim?
Well, what's going on is that the federal government, under the control of Commander-in-Chief Barack Obama, is trying to punish those Americans and those legislators who support reducing the, or might to a minor extent, the effects of the Obamacare debacle, which, of course, is so bad that the computers, after a week, are still not working. Nobody can sign up on this mess. But what's amazing is he would never get away with it. Certainly no Republican should get away with it or would get away with doing what is going on here if it wasn't for the media being absolutely on board in covering up all of these videos and all of the ridiculous things that are going on. I've spoken with many people just in the last few days who, number one, didn't know about the World War II vets not being able to go into the World War II memorial, which, by the way, was about 95% paid with private funds. Almost nobody on the left is aware of the fact that if you are near Mount Rushmore, there are any number of roads that will take you to the Mount Rushmore monument, and all along those roads are pull-offs so that you can stop your car and you can look out the window or you can take photos. The federal government has set up cones, those traffic cones, to keep people from pulling over into parking lots that are specifically made available by, one would think, taxpayer money to take a look at Mount Rushmore. We're finding that in Florida, there's apparently a big area of the ocean that is under some type of federal control. They're telling the fishermen that they can't fish out there. And there are any number of equally ridiculous situations that this very petulant, petty little government headed by Barack Obama, a petty little man, it seems, certainly if you judge him by his actions, these things are going on. You can be sure if George Bush was doing this, or Vice President Sarah Palin had been involved in this in any manner, that this would be front page news. You wouldn't be talking about Miley Cyrus last night on Saturday Night Live. The entire show would have been dedicated to the idiocy that we've been seeing just in the last week. And yet, ABC and NBC this morning, and almost all of the other regular media, have absolutely, I think, abandon any pretense of objectivity, and they're hiding it. They're not. These are legitimate. We got videos of people throwing the cones away and pulling their cars into otherwise blocked off areas so that they and their families can look at the Mount Rushmore, and fishermen, blasting through signs, saying you can't take your boat out and fish because it's a federally controlled waterway. So, if the media will allow government to do crazy things, things that are legal, I don't think that the government's doing anything that's illegal, but they're doing things that our society generally frowns upon. If the media will allow it to happen, it will not only continue to happen, it'll get worse. And folks, in the early years of Germany, there were any number of laws that were not broken. They were just very severely enforced by the leaders of the 1930s Germany.
What I find fascinating is when I look at polls, like I go to pollingreport.com often, and I'll look to see, and usually it'll say like the state of the union or direction of the country or where are you at on Speaker Bonner or Obama, and it will give you a cascade of all ABC News, Fox, and all kinds of even polling companies that frankly I'm not real familiar with, but it'll give you a feel for the general across the board rather than just looking at one poll or another that could be biased. What I find fascinating when I look at them is that there's a near equilibrium between who the citizens are blaming, whether it's the House of Representatives or President Obama. And I look at these things like hiring extra employees to put the cones out so that folks can't go into parks that are normally open air parks. I can't imagine that the citizenry in total would think that that's not just ugly, mean-spirited politics.
Only if they didn't know about it. That's the point. If the media is going to help Obama cover this up so that only the people who are out trying to utilize the event, if this isn't made fun of, then they can get away with it. It's an audacious standpoint. Again, they feel very comfortable. They must. They made this. My gosh, they had these planes filled of 90-year-old World War II heroes, and they felt comfortable enough to barricade. When I say they, this is Barack Obama's government felt comfortable enough to barricade these 90-year-olds in wheelchairs. From being able to come to an outdoor. This isn't the inside of a museum, folks. This is a 90+% public paid for, or privately paid for, it wasn't government money, outdoor memorial. I mean, that's audacious.
Open air walkthrough, never been employed with anybody that wouldn't. It's just absolute arrogance on the part of the administration.
And they bet they could get away with it. And it doesn't seem that bet is paying off because the word ever so slowly is getting out.
So I watch how government functions, and I look at all the numbers, and I say, okay, I heard this is government use of the word, not mine, but 6% of the federal employee pool are considered essential. Therefore, it's reasonable to think that means 94% of the government pool are non-essential employees.
That makes sense. We can do math.
Yeah, which causes a constitutionalist like me to say, what a coincidence, because if you look at the things that 95% of the government is doing, there's no constitutional authorization for the functions that we have in place. So I thought, okay, if we approach this problem differently, let's just employ people that can directly point to a something in the Constitution that allows for an expense in their areas. In other words, interstate commerce, national defense, foreign affairs. And everything else is just absolute hogwash. And what I'm finding in my little business in Spring Lake, things are fine without the government. I'm going to be okay.
I found at Norton Shores, just as a retired senior citizen, I don't notice any changes. I do see that there seems to be more traffic on Facebook as people more and more find these outrages and post them. But yeah, it seems to me that the Myers store is open and the trash got picked up, and the muggers continue to reproduce, providing jobs for the jailers and the rest of them. I'm with you.
I posed a question on Facebook last week, right at the onset of this. I said, a question for my progressive friends: if your life depended on the continuous operation of a clock for survival, would you rather that clock be built by the government or the private sector? And I go on to say, it's interesting to note that everything not dependent on government is working perfectly this morning. That was the day after this joke began. And one of my progressive friends, who was actually a vice president for I think it's Wayne State University.
Okay, for another government organization, right, essentially.
He responded that, yes, he'd rather have the government create the clock that his life would depend on.
Oh, good Lord.
And then he offered NIST-F1, which is the government's nuclear clock. So I quickly looked it up just to refresh myself. I got to laugh, because when you go to it, it says NIST is closed due to the lapse in government funding. But folks,
now, this is a site that is in operation. It's a computer site.
They had to pay somebody to shut down a static site. Think of the arrogance and the mean-spirited.
And your moronic friend that uses that as his example of confidence in government.
And I think he's the vice president of a university, really, and this is his argument, a closed-down website?
That's their argument. And it's clearly, if you were able to face him with those facts, he'd come up with another example or another excuse.
He never responded back.
Or he'd run for the tall grass. Yeah, that's another alternative. Yeah, run for the tall grass. Facts are painful.
Oh, yeah. In this case, he never responded back to that. So it was kind of a hit-and-run thing. But folks, I think what Jim and I are getting at is we got to pay attention to what these fellows, this government's doing to us.
Well, we're paying attention. What we need to do is to make sure that we get the word out so that people do find out what's going on. I remember on Monday when the big kickoff for Obamacare on the internet became very clearly to those of us, and I'm one of them, who would go online and see how it was working, see what my healthcare costs were going to be, because, of course, I was one of the millions of Americans who got a letter from my current healthcare provider, my current healthcare insurance company, and said because of federal law, we cannot continue to provide you with this same policy that you've had for over 5 years. So I went online. And the response, and you didn't really see much of this on right-wing radio, or you didn't see it at all, as a matter of fact. You didn't see it on Fox television or radio. What apparently on the left, and it finally filtered through me a day or two afterwards, was the president's spin on this is that, well, Apple computers products aren't always perfect on day one, and usually that's because they're so popular. And therefore, not only is this computer snafu very similar to the very successful Apple computer company, but President Barack Hussein Obama is really not all that different from Stephen Jobs. And that was the spin that millions of Americans heard, and probably millions of Americans on the left believed, because I started seeing this pop up on Tuesday and Wednesday. Now, come Wednesday afternoon, they were all out there in that tall grass with your Wayne State buddy, because they were not touting Stephen Jobs and Apple Computer, because this simplest part, I mean, think about it. They've had 3 years to put together a website. This is the simplest part of any kind of healthcare. That's the gathering of your name, address, phone number, and the rest. And that it doesn't work at all. And it still doesn't work, by the way. I checked it again this morning.
Interestingly, I'm about as far removed from tech savvy as you can get, but I've put up several websites of my own that will collect the basic data of anyone that's interested in getting more information from the things I've done by just simply filling in the drop-down menu blanks. So when I look at this, I thought, no kidding, can it really be so complicated that they can't find their way through it? And then I remember who we're talking about, and I say, yeah, it probably is. So I write, Dear Progressive, how do you rationalize an ideology which advances policies and programs that cannot exist without the forced participation of large percentages of the general population? And I signed it, forced participant.
Yeah, well, there again, you probably got that tall grass response. And again, I don't think you're going to change the disciples of President Barack Hussein Obama, those who think that for whatever reason, that we're hearing from Hollywood that, oh my golly, we dare not criticize him because he's the first black president, and or those who truly believe that that this vision that he has shown to be pretty tawdry is a vision that they share. The problem is that we need to get the media and the middle portion of America to see what this disaster is before it is too late. It may be too late, but the unexpected, I mean, nobody expected that something as simple setting up a website. I read a statistic, and it said something like Twitter gets more hits in a day, and Twitter's only been around a little more than 3 years, more hits in a day than this website is expected to get in a year.
Right.
So there's a little question, certainly with Hollywood and Silicon Valley and the rest of them supporting this, that there's a little question that this could have been done correctly. There's also a little question that it's been a debacle of an incredible size. It's truly unbelievably bad. It's so bad that it's hard to even explain.
I'll tell you, when I posed that question, Mary Valentine, former state representative in this area, responded to me, and she did so, and
Mary is a Democrat and a very loud and powerful voice within the Muskegon County Democrat Party also.
Right. So to my question, when I asked what kind of ideology is it that would only can succeed, assuming this is success, by forcing others, she writes, the purpose is so insurance companies cannot deny people because of pre-existing conditions. If someone does not want to join, they simply pay a small fee and remain uninsured. And then she goes on to offer a story about somebody that she knows that was born with or deals with juvenile diabetes. And the reason I'm wanting to draw this up today for us is a couple-fold. First off, it's not a small fee if you don't want to participate. It's a pretty significant fee. And most of the folks that may choose not to participate are probably going to be young men and women in their 20s that don't either have the money to pay for it or don't feel that they're in a health circumstance to need to pay for it. And the fee that they're going to pay, I guess things all are relative. And normally progressives see that. Normally But these folks are going to be hit with pretty significant fines that get more every year. But the really
what is the fee? Do you know?
Was it 1 or 2% of a person's income? But each year it's progressively more. There's an actual chart you have to read. So if you made,
which you can't get to the chart because, of course, the website is down.
It's down. So, but she, she did something that's really kind of part and parcel. And I got to tell listeners and you both, Jim, I rarely get into my own personal house circumstance. But I read what she does, and is every time that they come forward with health care or social service, whatever it is that they're rolling out, they always come up with two or three or four handicapped people or disabled people and point to them, and this is why we need to do that. And so I read her post, and I have to tell you, I'm disabled. I was put off a little bit by it. I responded to her back. I said, I was born with a congenital heart disorder. I've had 3 open heart surgeries and have twice fought battles with bacterial endocarditis, which is pneumonia of the heart, and a handful of other complications. I was born with that, so it's not something I got later in life or somewhere along the post. I'm now 52 years old and have never been turned down for insurance. Listen again, folks, I have never been turned down for insurance. I'm at 52 years old. I've had 3 open heart surgeries and was born with a cardiac defect. So when they wheel these people up on stage, or when Mary Valentine's comes up with some personal story that may or may not be true, it makes me gag. It's just a lie. That's the problem I have with it. So now at 52 years old, having never been turned down, Oscar, don't believe me. I'm telling you the facts. I have never been turned down.
I was turned down many times because of diabetes and of smoke. I was a smoker.
Well, I can't help you with your personal
I'm not saying that, but I'm just, even if I was a smoker, it was diabetes I was turned down for.
These are anecdotes, though, guys. The facts are, though, that we do have people who did have pre-existing conditions. I had 4 pre-existing conditions, one that required 14 surgeries prior to me getting the health care, and this was with Blue Cross Blue Shield. And I had, I believe, 10 or 12 health care insurance companies who bid on my business. So, yes, I'm sure there are people who were unable to find it. There are anecdotes on both sides. But this concept, this blatant lie that if you have a pre-existing condition, you cannot get health care is not blanket, certainly across those. Certainly, how many people do you know that have had 14 surgeries and had absolutely no trouble getting health insurance? I
got to tell you, the only thing that I have found to be true since they came up with this Marxist care is that now cost of premiums have more than doubled and cost of deductibles have tripled. And so I say to myself, whether it's true for you, Oscar, or not true for me, who in the heck can afford this affordable health care? What are they thinking to even have the audacity, to use that word, to call this affordable health care? It's grossly insulting.
Well, I know, in order, as I've mentioned before, but in order to get the same level of health care insurance that I had with a similar deductible, a similar copay, and similar coverage, my insurance will go up 300%.
Oscar,
yeah,
Jim, hold all those thoughts. We're going to go to a break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Renegade River Show with Jim Riley and Mike Hewitt. Jim, I need you to do me a favor. Navigate us forward.
Well, that's an interesting term. You may have heard of these healthcare navigators. There's been a lot of brouhaha over these over the last few months, as it turned out that the federal government was going to spend what will likely become billions of dollars to hire people who would then be trained and then would be available to citizens like myself and the 3 of us sitting here in the studio, help us navigate through this somewhat complex healthcare decision-making process. Now, the odd thing about that, of course, is that with the exception of people who've never had health care insurance before, every one of us has gotten health care insurance, so we really don't need somebody to help us. But nonetheless, federal government created this program called Navigators. Well, after the collapse on Monday of the Obamacare computer system, I said, well, at least I know that we've hired, we've paid for, the federal government has hired these navigators, and I will see if I can find one. Well, do yourself a little favor and get into your search engine. I no longer use Google, by the way. I've switched to Bing, and it is so much better. But it really is. It shocks me at how much better it is. It's much like when I went from Internet Explorer to Chrome. But I'm Binging now, and I binged Navigator in any number of different formats. Mostly what I got were hits talking about the Navigator jobs, so which are, it's too late to get one of those jobs now, at least officially. They apparently on the website say they're no longer taking applications. So those people that have all been hired, trained, and ready to go, I've been unable to find any Navigator per se. Now, ultimately, I did put in, I think, went to something called localhelp.healthcare.gov, and you put in your zip code, and in this case, they had some hits that did come up. One is the called the Health Project, which is the mercyhealth.com. One is Muskegon Family Care, which is a clinic essentially set up to help mostly Medicaid people. One called Baldwin Family Health, which is in Grant, and that's about it. But those are the two. I called both of those. The people on the phones had no idea what a healthcare navigator was. So these navigators may exist. They may be trained. They may be knowledgeable. But there certainly is no direct way to get to a navigator. There's no way that you might submit your information so that a navigator would have it in advance of providing you some health or some help in your search. So, you know, as many of us are talking about this debacle with the internet and the website and the first door that you would take in entering government-controlled healthcare, don't forget that there's any number of other billions of dollars that have already been spent and will continue to be spent on this Navigator program, which some cynics might call just another big government employment program, an excuse to hire a bunch of people who will be guaranteed to vote for their employers, which would be the Democrats in the United States. And I'd like to just add this to it. There are so many people out there that are saying, well, gosh, you know, the Republicans are fighting on this, something you can never win. You know, America voted on this, and on and on and on. Well, President Bush, during his term as president, there was a law that was passed which was going to build a border fence. It was called the Border Fence Law of 2006, I believe, or Secure Fence Act of 2006. That was passed, signed by the president. When the Democrats took over the House and the Senate in 2007, they said, we don't like this law anymore, and they got rid of it. So this concept that a law that has been passed is inviolable, can never be touched, changed, criticized, looked at, and askew, is an absolute bogus lie put up by the Obama administration and allowed to stand, and this to me is the more distressing part, allowed to stand by the media that doesn't correct the bogus lie that is being floated around. So the fact is, we do have an opportunity to change this Obamacare debacle. You can imagine if only the Republicans decided to create and force through a health care law as encompassing as this, without any Democrat contributions whatsoever, what the outrage would be.
I have to tell you, there's still outrage on the left because there's a pretty large splinter of progressive, the Democrat Party and progressives in general, that truly don't think this goes anywhere near far enough, and they're advocating a single payer system. But to your point of navigators, do you recall ever being told how navigators were supposed to interact with society, how they were going to actually help us? What mechanism were they going to use to reach out to the public?
I never knew what the mechanism was. I just I assumed that if I was interested in getting help in the same manner that I would if I was interested in getting a quote for health insurance, or car insurance, or homeowners, or what have you, I would either look in the yellow pages, which of course unlikely since this is a relatively new program, or I would go online and I would just put in navigators, healthcare navigators, government navigators, American the Affordability Care Act. I tried all of that. So no, I assumed that we would go to them rather than they would outreach to us. Maybe you know more.
I binged for the first time.
You know what? You look healthier already.
Oh yeah, I'm feeling way better. Yeah, no more health problems for me. So what I'm learning while you were talking is that the way it was originally billed for only $67 million was that these navigators were literally going to be doing a door-to-door campaign to make sure the citizens of America knew just exactly how to interact with the Unaffordable Health Care
I never
Act.
heard that. That's interesting.
Yeah, $67 million for that, and of course that's never come to pass and never will. And the reason I bring it up, aside from the fact that it helped shed a little light on what a navigator really is, a navigator in this instance is a lie, is never going to happen. And unless you can stumble upon some mechanism a year from now for it to engage, that's going to fall by the wayside the same way the help for Benghazi fell by the wayside. It's not going to be.
You know, what you just said there is some might say, oh, that's terribly unfair, but those people were waiting for help from the federal government, the United States government, and they got, certainly they suffered a worse fate than we will suffer, but they got a similar style, a similar quality of help that we're likely to get from these navigators. Interesting.
They're just not. In fact, the statistics say more people were sent to keep the 90-year-olds out of the World War II memorial than were sent to help the people in Benghazi. Think about that for a minute. And that's literally a factual number.
That's sick, and it's true.
Yeah.
And I can guarantee you that if George Bush or Mitt Romney or Sarah Palin had been president of the United States when the Benghazi event happened, and when this absolute shameful event happened at the World War II memorial, that last night's Saturday Night Live, this morning's TV shows, would be packed with absolute insulting sarcasm aimed at the President of the United States. Sadly, that's not the case today.
You ever hear of a guy named Bob Geldof? I don't know if I'm saying
Yes.
Who is this guy? He says the world's going to end, by the way, folks, in 2030.
I'm not sure you're pronouncing it correctly.
I'm sure I'm not.
I've got it on my blog.
I can't say how I would pronounce it because I'm on the air right now.
Bob was a pretty famous guy back, I think, perhaps in the 80s. Geldof, I think it might have been. He's actually a sir. He was knighted.
Yeah.
Bob was a sort of a has-been musician of some sort. I don't know if he had any hits or not, but he was one of the leaders to bring these concerts, to bring together groups of musicians to raise money for hunger. And actually, I see Oscar's shaking his head here. Jump in here, Oscar. It was Bob Geldof, was it not?
Yeah, Geldof, yeah.
Okay.
Geldof.
Anyway, he's if you've ever seen him, he's exactly what you would expect of probably a 70-something rocker who's been around a long time. He doesn't appear to have all of his nuts and bolts in the correct spots. But for whatever reason, he has deemed that, quote, the world will end in 2030. And interesting, he's got an exact date. I got to like that. It's certainly better than Al Gore's. But the world will end in 2030 because of the effects of climate change.
It looks like he stole Gomez Adams' suit.
Well, I don't know who Gomez Adams is.
From the Adams family.
Oh, okay.
How could you forget Gomez Adams?
Well, because I didn't see the movie. That's why I forgot it.
This guy is quite serious. It's more global warming.
Well, the goofy thing to me is that you have found it in probably a different spot than I did. That this gentleman, probably a nice guy, that his ravings about anything other than music would even be worthy of any type of news event, and yet here we are in the middle of all sorts of interesting things going on in the world, and we're talking about an old druggie who's apparently a climatologist to boot.
Well, encapsulate what you just said for a minute. Ravings from a nice guy.
Maybe he's not nice, but he certainly was raving.
He is raving. I just had to didn't want to take us off our path, but to me these are the foundational people to the progressive movement, the Democrat Party in general. When I say who puts money into that kind of thinking, that's the reason I brought it up, because this is the kind of fella that thinks that Obamacare with 3 times the before we even get going on it, 3 times the deductible makes sense. That doesn't make sense to me, but it probably makes sense to this nice guy.
Actually, my deductible, if I was to pay the same amount per month as I'm currently paying under the new Obama rules and regulations, my deductible that I would have to pay first before I got any coverage would go from $1,000 to $7,500.
Here's a shock for you.
And that would be the same price, $1,000 to $7,500.
It's insane.
Well,
to me, it's
unaffordable.
It's just absolutely insane. Here's a shocker for you: illegal immigration's on the rise again.
That's interesting because we know that it had slowed down because there were no jobs for these illegal immigrants to take. Why would it be on the rise, do you think?
I don't know, but if you skip ahead, the United Kingdom is ending their free health care for migrants.
Well, I think, when you talk about, we're changing subjects here, but if you're going to talk about the immigration problem, ultimately the real problem, of course, is that we have any number of laws, federal laws and state laws, probably some local laws down in the border states that are just simply not being enforced. And if we were to enforce those laws, things would probably be a lot different. But the real ultimate problem, because we don't have a problem in America with the migrants that used to come in and still do, and they provide a tremendous benefit to American agriculture and doing any number of other things, where they would come in and then they would go back to Mexico when the season happened to be over. The problem came about when certain states and the federal government said, if you come to our state, we will give you free stuff. You do not have to prove that you're an American citizen. We will give you all sorts of free things. We will give you free housing. We will give you free food. We will give you free medical. If you're lucky enough to have a child here, we'll make your child an American citizen. And that alone will be enough to make the rest of your family eligible for future benefits in perpetuity. We can end all of this mess simply by saying if you're here illegally, you can't get free stuff. Simple. We don't have to bus them up and get them out of here. Just stop giving them the free things. If they're unhappy being here, if they start getting thin, or if in fact they're not healthy, we can take them back to Mexico from where they came, or Colombia, or wherever it may have been, Canada, and we can drop them off and they can get the free stuff in the country from whence they came.
Now, for me, I'm all about immigration. I heartily endorse immigration. Legal immigration. I don't endorse because the things that you listed are from the same ideology that controls our governments. Think about this for a minute. The combined total of our governments in America, and this is from the Census Bureau report, you add up local, state, and federal, government employees in total now are in excess of 24 million. And you go, holy mackerel, how can that be? That's the combined total, equivalent to the combined total of all of the citizens of Michigan and Illinois and most of Indiana.
And are you talking now federal, state, and local, or just federal?
Federal, state, and local, 24 million.
I think that's probably a low number because you're probably not including school employees. You're probably not including hospital employees and clinic employees, where the vast majority of their funding comes from government. You're probably not including university employees.
Probably no, definitely not in university, because I got to tell you this. It's funny that you say that, because I spent about an hour trying to drill down on just the question of who's employed by a government, whether it's county, local municipality, state, or federal. And that's without getting off into universities and schools.
Sure.
It's impossible to determine exactly who we employ. And really, it really goes to the difference of what, at least how, I see it as a defining difference with how the left and the right see the role of government.
We're going to take a break shortly here, but if we could, I'd like to mention something that I think is a lot more, believe it or not, has a lot more impact on our lives than the federal government. And that is the state and local government spending. And here in Muskegon, we have something that I think is very frightening that has just been done and will continue to be done if we don't wake people up to it.
Let's pick up on that when we come back from a break, folks. We'll be right back.
You're listening to
Renegade River in Spring Lake wants to buy your used handguns and hunting guns. Renegade River, your hunting, camping, and survival store. Stop in and check out their new and used firearms, sporting goods, Army and Navy supplies, and survival gear. Downtown Spring Lake, next to the police station.
I run a small business. For me, time really is money. So I got all my paperwork.
And they've been almost open and notorious now for quite a while.
Courtesy Fox News Sunday. Fox News, we report, you decide.
Here's the official News Talk 1090 WKBZ forecast. Today, cloudy with a few showers and even a rumble of thunder possible, a high of 62. Southwest winds 5 to 10. Some clouds tonight, a low around 50 with west winds 5 to 10. Cloudy tomorrow with occasional showers and a high of 61. Northwest winds 10 to 15. And back to sunshine on Tuesday with a high of 64. And another sunny day expected on Wednesday with a high of 67. Keeping you informed, News Talk 1090 WKBZ, the talk of Muskegon.
Welcome back to the Renegade River Show. Jim Riley?
I'm back.
I'm back too. Tell us about local government, Jim.
Well, I've mentioned this back. Of course, I had the Eye on Muskegon show for some time. And if you add up the amounts of money that the average American, certainly the average person living in Muskegon County or the counties surrounding here, what you really spend in taxes and fees, most of us spend more money in local taxes, local and state, than we do in federal taxes. So certainly what the federal government does, how it borrows, the things that it spends its money on or doesn't spend its money on, it affects us. But we are far more affected by what goes on locally. Certainly roads come from, yes, there's federal money, but the roads also are funded by local money, and the decisions of which roads to repair and when to repair them, our police and our fire, sales taxes, which of course are, as we sit here, there are groups of smarter people than us trying to figure out ways to convince people in Muskegon to increase the sales tax. We have, of course, state income tax. Just about every failed city in the state of Michigan has a city income tax. We have all sorts of fees that have been put on our telephones and our cable TV. Take a look at your electric bill and your gas bill. There are all sorts of additional fees and taxes that have been put on those bills. We here in Muskegon County, we're finding our water costs are going up dramatically. Our sewer costs are going up dramatically. Those fees and the increases for the services are a direct result, not of Barack Obama or George Bush or any of the folks who are out there in Washington. They are a direct result of what happens in our state legislature, but even more so in our county and in our city councils and townships. And I'd like to bring up one issue that just came up within a couple weeks ago. It's been building for a few years, but this is the new jail that is going to be built here in Muskegon County. Now, Muskegon County has a discretionary budget of around $42 million. They have long-term debt. This is underfunded debt of underfunding of the county employee and retirees of about something well over $100 million. They have about $100 million in bonded debt. The county has just decided about a month ago to borrow, as it turns out, almost $40 million to build a new jail. Now, the arguments to building the new jail, there are arguments on both sides. Let's just assume for the moment that this new jail is necessary. It makes sense. Well, what you can do is you can put a millage. You can say, folks, we need a new jail. Here are the reasons why we would have a new jail. And then let the citizens vote on that. That's not what happened in Muskegon. As a matter of fact, almost every single county commissioner, and those are the people who make the decision here, said, no, we would definitely let the citizens vote on this. This is prior to the last election. There was never a vote. But the reason I bring this up is it was promised, much like the Nancy Pelosi, you must read the bill, you must pass the bill in order to find out what's inside it. We were promised by the chairman of the Democrat-controlled Muskegon County Board of Commissioners that the new jail would cost $23 million. And we were also told by the county administrator, Bonnie Hammersley, that there was $7 million that had been saved. It was initially over $10 million, but at this point it still was $7 million that was saved to go towards the new jail. Well, the math isn't all that tough. It's going to be we're going to need to borrow around $20 million. Well, this plan has grown now. They're adding to it a what they call a juvenile transition center, basically juvie home, which to my knowledge, there's one up where you live, Oscar, and I've heard no complaints about that whatsoever. Well, they're going to move that one, and they're going to build a brand new one. But the new juvenile transition center, which they're saying is going to cost $10 million. Well, if you do the math, that's about $30 million of the new jail, subtracting out the $7 million and adding the $10 million. And yet they went out and they have the money in hand, I believe. They either have it in hand now, or they'll have it within just a few days. Almost $40 million. There's $10 million floating around in what can only be called a slush fund. We have a county that cannot pay the adequate money to cover its promises to its employees and its retirees for their health and retirement benefits to the tune of $100 million, and it's going up every year. We're going out and borrowing the equivalent of an annual full year's worth of budget on this jail. And this is just one of many big expenditures that we're seeing in this county. We know that Muskegon Heights school system went bankrupt. The city of Muskegon, or the Muskegon Public Schools, essentially went bankrupt. They said, we don't have enough money to pay our employees, and it was taken over by the intermediate school district. Now, there's been absolutely no publicity about that, with the exception of this little one, the intermediate school district, which just celebrated, by the way, winning the what was it? The breastfeeding location award. This is just in today's paper. The intermediate school district is tickled. They snagged the second annual breastfeeding friendly award.
No pun intended, I'm sure.
That's what's important apparently to the newspaper. But the Muskegon Intermediate School District has now taken over the finances of the Muskegon Public Schools, the largest school system in the county, and they have said, we're going to have a new millage coming up. Probably in an off month, so that the rest of the snowbirds and others will not have a chance to pay. My point here is, at a time when we know the federal government is hurting, at a time when the state tells us incessantly that there isn't enough money to fix the roads, that we have to have new taxes, at a time when the county says we can't do any number of things that we must do, it seems to me that the spending and the irresponsibility is going through the roof. Anytime you have a county whose finances are Detroit-like, and clearly people knew 25 years ago that Detroit was going off a cliff. Nobody did anything. Who knows? Muskegon County could go another 25 years. But anytime you have finances that are this mismanaged, anytime that you've got millages that are going to be passed that are going to increase taxes, not just on the rest of us, but on the companies who may or may not come into our community, or who may expand in our community, or who may just move out. It's one thing to say it's only going to cost a guy who's got a $100,000 value house, it's only going to cost him $82 a year. It's another thing when we find out when you've got a large company and you're thinking about moving here. We know that the fastest job growth city in the United States just recently was Holland, Michigan. We know that one of the worst job growth counties and cities in the United States of America is right here in our county, in the city of Muskegon. So, folks, what goes on locally really matters. National stuff really matters also. But if you're going to sit back and take it, I can promise you they're going to give it to you.
I can tell you this about all that. Just a couple things. First is that you made me think of Tip O'Neill for a minute, in as much as the only thing that I think that man ever said in his whole life I agreed with was that all politics is local.
And it ought to be.
He was exactly spot on, because everything that we do on a local basis will inevitably control what goes on in the federal government and what goes on locally. And in fact, I've said many times that most liberty and treasury is lost on a local basis. But the problem with it is that that is the devil part of the details. So it's a lot easier to paint with a big broad brush and look at Lansing, or especially D.C. I'll tell you, though, recently, this past Monday, I want to touch on this before we run out of time, and it actually dovetails with what you're talking about today. This past Monday, I spent about an hour or so in the morning with my Senator Meekoff. And then that evening, I went to a Kent County GOP dinner event, and I got to listen to a presentation or a speech by State Senator Albert Guillory, who I think he's from Louisiana. He's the black fellow that here back 6 or 7 months ago switched. He's a state senator, and he switched parties from the Democrat Party.
From Louisiana.
I think it's Louisiana, but a super nice guy. But at any rate, he gave a speech that evening, and I'm dovetailing those two before I run out of time here. I had been on a push to try to build an effort to primary challenge some of the Republicans that I believe to be rhinos. I
think it's a great idea.
Yeah, perhaps, but I went through a little bit of an epiphany on that. And frankly, it's a result of having my meeting with Senator Meekhoff, but more so after listening to Senator Guillory describe what republicanism is. Not Republican or Democrat, but what republicanism is. And to me, I got to tell you, it was truly a profound speech that he gave. And it moved me a little bit, and it caused me to look at this whole idea of primarying a little bit differently. And I said to myself, what were the founders doing when they were trying to promote the new Constitution? And the answer is they were looking to educate the constituency. They were looking to educate the citizenry. And it causes me to say, rather than fight in the same districts over and over again, and for instance, in the House of Representatives, there's, depending on who's telling the story, somewhere between 10 and 15 of the House 110 seats that are right marginal. They can be a Republican, they could be a Democrat from election to election. And rather than beating up the whoever's sitting in that chair that's trying to straddle the fence, I think it'd be money better spent and energy better served to educate the folks in those communities on what republicanism, small r, what republicanism is, what our founding was, and why it's important to look forward with. I wrote here, wise leadership would be working to recapture the best intentions of our founders while purposefully marching forward. I think concepts like that will help to change those districts, like Senator Jeff Hansen. You and I have talked about this in the past on this show. This guy, I don't agree with his voting record. On the other hand, I'm probably out of step and out of line with his district, which causes me to say a lot of those folks don't know the meaning of republicanism or how to better embrace or even what liberty is, literally.
Why would you vote for someone, again, who has betrayed you? Why would you vote? And let's talk about Senator Hansen, because Senator Hansen on his website is very clear. He talks about small government. He talks about fiscal responsibility, and he has of late taken some votes that are clearly at odds with that. Do you continue to support them?
We don't have enough time. We'll pick up on that debate next week, but what I'll tell you is
we'll be back.
We'll be back, but to me, in closing, it doesn't matter whether it's Hansen or whoever we replace Hansen with. That district that he sits in right now, that he represents to the state Senate, those folks are what causes Jeff Hansen's and folks like him to be elected, that are contrary to yours and my politics, no question about it. But to me, it goes back to education, and I think that it is incumbent upon us to, rather than worrying about Hansen, to reach out to the district he serves.
We are going to disagree and have fun next week, I think.
I'm looking forward to that one, folks. Folks, I appreciate everyone listening. Next Sunday at high noon, we will be back. And next Sunday, by the way, we're going to talk about the new addition to Renegade River, the Consignment Emporium.
Ooh, sounds good.
Thanks, folks. Talk to you next Sunday.
Point. If the media is going to help Obama cover this up so that only the people who are out trying to utilize the event, if this isn't made fun of, then they can get away with it. It's an audacious standpoint. Again, they feel very comfortable. They made this. My gosh, they had these planes filled of 90-year-old World War II heroes, and they felt comfortable enough to barricade. When I say they, this is Barack Obama's government felt comfortable enough to barricade these 90-year-olds in wheelchairs. Yeah, from being able to come to an outdoor. This isn't the inside of a museum, folks. This is a 90+% public paid for, or privately paid for, it wasn't government money, outdoor memorial. That's audacious.
Open air walkthrough, never been employed with anybody that wouldn't. It's just absolute arrogance on the part of the administration.
And they bet they could get away with it, and it doesn't seem that bet is paying off because the word ever so slowly is getting out.
So I watch how government functions, and I look at all the numbers, and I say, okay, I heard this is government use of the word, not mine, but 6% of the federal employee pool are considered essential. Therefore, it's reasonable to think that that means 94% of the government pool are non-essential employees.
That makes sense. We can do math.
Yeah, which causes a constitutionalist like me to say, what a coincidence, because if you look at the things that 95% of the government is doing, there's no constitutional authorization for the functions that we have in place. So I thought, okay, if we approach this problem differently, let's just employ people that can directly point to a Welcome, you're listening to the Renegade Rivers Show, and my name is Mike Hewitt, and in the studio today is Jim Riley.
I'm back.
Jim.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. You got to tell me, I'm really confused. Government says it's shut down, but it looks like 83% of the government is still operating, except for the parts that are most obvious to the citizenry, like, say, the World War II monument or the bags over the tops of the heads of Mount Rushmore. I'm a little bit confused. What's really going on, Jim?
Well, what's going on is that the federal government, under the control of Commander-in-Chief Barack Obama, is trying to punish those Americans and those legislators who support reducing the, or might to a minor extent, the effects of the Obamacare debacle, which of course is so bad that the computers after a week are still not working. Nobody can sign up on this mess. But what's amazing is he would never get away with it. Certainly no Republican should get away with it or would get away with doing what is going on here if it wasn't for the media being absolutely on board in covering up all of these videos and all of the ridiculous things that are going on. I've spoken with many people just in the last few days who, number one, didn't know about the World War II vets not being able to go into the World War II memorial, which, by the way, was about 95% paid with private funds. Almost nobody on the left is aware of the fact that if you are near Mount Rushmore,
something in the Constitution that allows for an expense in their areas. In other words, interstate commerce, national defense, foreign affairs, and everything else is just absolute hogwash. And what I'm finding in my little business in Spring Lake, things are fine without the government. I'm going to be okay.
I found at Norton Shores, just as a retired senior citizen, I don't notice any changes. I do see that there seems to be more traffic on Facebook as people more and more find these outrages and post them. But yeah, it seems to me that the Myers store is open and the trash got picked up, and the muggers continue to reproduce, providing jobs for the jailers and the rest of them. I'm with you.
I posed a question on Facebook last week, right at the onset of this. I said, a question for my progressive friends: if your life depended on the continuous operation of a clock for survival, would you rather that clock be built by the government or the private sector? And I go on to say, it's interesting to note that everything not dependent on government is working perfectly this morning. That was the day after this joke began. And one of my progressive friends, who was actually a vice president for I think it's Wayne State University.
Okay, for another government organization, right, essentially.
He responded that, yes, he'd rather have the government create the clock that his life would depend on.
Oh, good Lord.
And then he offered NIST-F1, which is the government's nuclear clock. So I quickly looked it up just to refresh myself. I got to laugh, because when you go to it, it says NIST is closed due to the...
or are there any number of roads that will take you to the Mount Rushmore monument? And all along those roads are pull-offs so that you can stop your car and you can look out the window or you can take photos. The federal government has set up cones, those traffic cones, to keep people from pulling over into parking lots that are specifically made available by, one would think, taxpayer money to take a look at Mount Rushmore. We're finding that in Florida, there's apparently a big area of the ocean that is under some type of federal control. They're telling the fishermen that they can't fish out there. And there are any number of equally ridiculous situations that this very petulant, petty little government headed by Barack Obama, a petty little man, it seems, certainly if you judge him by his actions, these things are going on. You can be sure if George Bush was doing this, or Vice President Sarah Palin had been involved in this in any manner, that this would be front page news. You wouldn't be talking about Miley Cyrus last night on Saturday Night Live. The entire show would have been dedicated to the idiocy that we've been seeing just in the last week. And yet, ABC and NBC this morning, and almost all of the other regular media, have absolutely, I think, abandoned any pretense of objectivity, and they're hiding it. They're not. These are legitimate. We got videos of people throwing the cones away and pulling their cars into otherwise blocked off areas so that they and their families can look at the Mount Rushmore and fishermen, blasting through signs, saying you can't take your boat out and fish because it's a federally controlled waterway. So, if the media will allow government to do crazy things, things that are legal, I don't think that the government's doing anything that's illegal, but they're doing things that our society generally frowns upon. If the media will allow it to happen, it will not only continue to happen, it'll get worse. And folks, in the early years of Germany, there were any number of laws that were not broken. They were just very severely enforced by the leaders of the 1930s Germany.
What I find fascinating is when I look at polls, like I go to pollingreport.com often, and I'll look to see, and usually it'll say like the state of the union or direction of the country or where are you at on Speaker Bonner or Obama, and it will give you a cascade of all ABC News, Fox, and all kinds of even polling companies that frankly I'm not real familiar with, but it'll give you a feel for the general across the board rather than just looking at one poll or another that could be biased. What I find fascinating when I look at them is that there's a near equilibrium between who the citizens are blaming, whether it's the House of Representatives or President Obama. And I look at these things like hiring extra employees to put the cones out so that folks can't go into parks that are normally open air parks. I can't imagine that the citizenry in total would think that that's not just ugly, mean-spirited politics.
Only if they didn't know about it. That's the